Holy God, open our eyes to your presence, open our ears to your call, open our hearts to your love. Amen.
Amen.
I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is covenantal language from Jeremiah. This is both ancient and new covenantal language, and it is beautiful. It is redemptive. It is reconciling. It is the language of our God who, despite our broken promises, our broken laws, and our many broken relationships, says to us anyway, "You shall be my people." And this is not a hopeful dream or some idealistic goal of God's. This is God's firm statement of commitment to us. This is a statement of unconditional love, also known as grace. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It's a big promise, a big covenant, a big deal. It can be difficult to imagine the enormity of what is going on here because we don't often think in terms of covenantal language. Even those more fluent in church speak can get confused. Covenant is often understood as a synonym for contract, but it isn't. It isn't a contract, not really. It's binding, but it's not an agreement between two equals who are both willing parties in this agreement. Covenants in ancient times were made between tribal or family patriarchs, often in protection or benefit of a third party who is not equal in the relationship, and their consent is not required. A perfect example of this is the ancient marriage covenant, which Jeremiah alludes to. The marriage covenant was not, as we have come to believe, a covenant between the two people marrying. It was an agreement between the groom and the bride's protector, her father or brother. And it is set up to be more of a transactional exchange, which, by the way, hasn't really changed much over time and tradition. In the Book of Common Prayer, which was last updated in 1979, there is still provision for giving away the bride, for example. It's not a quaint tradition. It's distressing. Or at least I find it troubling, and try to steer couples toward a different approved marriage liturgy, which was written initially for use at same-sex blessings before there was marriage equality. The liturgy is called, "I will bless you, and you will be a blessing," which takes its name from the Abrahamic covenant and reflects a different kind of relationship. The kind where God is not only involved in the relationship, but is the catalyst for something new. Where two separate yet whole people come together in a new way to share equally in the work of love for the good or the blessing of us all. We are blessed to be a blessing. That is the result of our covenantal relationship with God as recorded throughout our sacred story. God, as the initiator of all covenants, has been consistent in keeping faithful to them. Equally, as often as God has been consistently faithful to the covenant, humanity has been consistent in breaking them. Every single time. Since the days of creation. And still God claims us and says to us, I can work with that. Jeremiah tells us that God will forgive our iniquity and remember our sin no more. God recognizes what we often do not. We cannot do this on our own. It's why our responses in our baptismal covenant are not just I do or I will. Instead, our responses acknowledge our dependence on the holy. I will, with God's help. No matter how hard we try, we cannot save ourselves. So here before us in our readings is our God of love drawing us near and offering us yet another way and writing that narrative directly on our hearts. Chapters 30 and 31 of Jeremiah, from which today's reading from the Hebrew Scriptures come, these two chapters are known as the Book of Comfort. This book within a book points to a future of restoration, of return from exile. But the specifics, the timelines, etc., remain unclear. All the people are told is that hope is on the horizon. Hope is on the horizon! Imagine that! Imagine being a people stuck in a place in exile from a way of life they once knew and still longed for. And now hope is on the horizon to return to the way things were. We don't have to imagine that, do we? Because we're living it. After a year of pandemic-imposed exile from our families, our friends, our routines, our communities, and our communion, we don't need Jeremiah to tell us that we are finally on the threshold of something because it's palpable. And I'll confess, I'm anxious about that. I'm anxious about our return from exile. I'm anxious that we will sabotage it. I mean, we've eased up on guidelines and directives before, and infection rates are surging again in Michigan. I'm anxious that our return to normalcy won't meet our expectations. That after a year of lingering in the longing, we've built up a memory of life before the pandemic to some mythological proportions that can't possibly be matched, particularly around church. And in a weird twist, after a year of happily introverting, I mean, I'm good with a book and my dogs. So after a year of happily introverting, of waiting, I'm also anxious that our return from exile isn't happening fast enough. I was talking to one of my sons about how impatient I've grown ever since I was able to make my vaccination appointment. I had my first dose on Friday, by the way. Yay! He said, well, that makes sense. There's a difference between being hungry and knowing there's food, and being hungry and smelling that food cooking. In other words, I'm hangry with an H. I'm angry or impatient because I'm hungry. I hunger to see my kids again. I hunger to hug my 93-year-old mother. I hunger for a tangible community. I hunger for this particular community. I hunger to meet you. And of course, I'm anxious about that too. Can we gather safely? Is it too soon? Worry is a spiritual gift of mine. Not to brag, but I'm exceptional at worrying. And if worry is a gift of yours too, well, good news. There's plenty of unknowns to go around as we navigate this brave new world of ours. As was the case in Jeremiah, the details of what our return will actually look like and the specific timeline remains unclear. That said, what I find especially comforting in the Jeremiah reading is that God, through the use of covenant, is providing a way to manage our expectations. I think you're really going to want to lean in and listen to Jeremiah here, especially my fellow expert worriers and lamenters, because it's important. Are you ready? Things will not be the same, dear faithful. When we return to our buildings, when we regather in person, it won't be the same. It won't be. What's more, it is not meant to be. There is no going back to the way things were. Because right here, in our time, in this place, God is doing something new with us. All of us. And the good news is, our only responsibility is to trust the narrative written on our hearts. The one that says, God will be our God, and we shall be God's people. And you know what, dear faithful? We will, with God's help. Thanks be to God.